can I steal a moment of your time before this episode plays? Thanks so much for listening to Labours of Sports Coaching. The appetite I see for the blend of academic and practical coaching conversations happening on the show is nothing short of amazing, and I'm determined to make this show bigger and better. Now, to help with that mission, please can I ask that you follow and rate the show 5 stars wherever you're listening. This takes maybe 10 seconds and has a massive effect on increasing the show's visibility, and as a result of that, its potential for future growth, which ultimately will enhance your return as a committed listener. Also check out the show support links for anyone looking to offer that extra bit of backing. There's much more to come for Labours of Sports Coaching, and I thank you for joining and driving our new community. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. Today I've got the pleasure of being joined by Dr Jordan Donnelly from the University of the West of Scotland. Jordan is a lecturer in sports development, and his work centres around sports for development programmes. Firstly, John, how are you? It's great to have you here.
Good, thanks for having me on. Feeling good, feeling ready to go for this.
Great. We were actually just speaking off there, and I'm really excited about this episode just purely because we're speaking about coaching happening in a space where, I think, loads of outcomes are meaningful regardless of where coaching takes place. But we're talking about coaching in sports for development programs where we're trying to help, members of society who have had a really tough draw, and we're trying to reintegrate them or indeed try to help them thrive based on whatever starting point they came from, and that it's really, really, really meaningful. But without me trying to talk to this subject, can you maybe kick it off for us by telling us what is a sport for development program and what makes a sport for development coach?
Yeah, so sport for development programs largely in the beginning have their origins in North America. They started off as what's known as a deficit reduction paradigm. So they were centered around looking at problems that existed within society, blaming the people involved for contributing or causing these problems, and then it was used as a deficit to remove those problems for society. So in the first instance, research-wise, is the midnight basketball leagues of inner city Chicago around inner city gun violence, and then what was found after that was because there was no meaningful traction or meaningful development within those, gun violence would just be paused for however long the program was on for, and then whoever was involved would return to it. So there wasn't anything meaningful, there wasn't anything sort of a delve towards why these problems were happening, or the people involved are targeting some of their development. So in the sort of a last couple of decades, then it's seen a drive towards positive developmental outcomes. So strength-based drives towards interpersonal and intrapersonal development. So the role of the coach within that is to foster a positive environment, create a positive culture within these programs, and then work towards things like positive youth development and life skill development and transfer, with the whole supposition around these programs being that they foster develop skills within the programs, and then they're widely applicable in the wider world, and, for example, education, employment, or relationships outside of the programs.
Mm-hmm. And what, if in a bit more detail, then what sort of demographic are they aimed towards then? So who are the typical people that are involved, that are the recipients of these programs that the coaches then try to work with?
Yeah, so it's usually on the basis of positive youth development. So looking to develop people who are in the formative years, so preparing them for life beyond childhood so that they can enter the workplace or relationship spaces, education, ready and prepared for that. In other instances, as in socioeconomic inequality cases, so people who are deprived, hard to reach, come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and so on. In the Western world, that is typically towards individuals that sort of fall below the poverty line, and then it works differently across different parts of the world. So there's a lot of work been done in South Africa. There's a lot of work been done in terms of conflict zones and so on. So sport for development for me is very much termed in the sense of the Western world. But however, beyond my research and beyond the work that I'm done, there's a lot of targeted work towards conflict zones or parts of the world that face difficult issues, and it's largely the coach that can be involved in different adversities depending on where in the world that program exists. So a lot of the work done in South Africa is geared towards things like substance misuse and perhaps HIV/AIDS prevention. So the role of the coach would be as an educator to sort of educate someone about the adversities associated with sharing needles, with unprotected sex, and so on. But then if you look to target it for, say, the west of Scotland or the northeast of Scotland, it might be around sort of a strength-based drives towards criminal desistance or staying away from drugs and alcohol or rehabilitating someone that's been involved in heroin use or homelessness. So it's very much dependent on the role of the organisation, and very much it's malleable in terms of what's the role of the coach in that organisation, depending on the adversities or the issues faced by the service user.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I'm thinking certainly nationally. I know there's a lot of work that Celtic Foundation does, or is it street soccer? There's different charity groups that go with different names, but and across different sports. But you've hit it in the head there around what the outcomes are. That sometimes it doesn't seem to have much to do with sport, but it's through sport. So could you help us sort of distinguish then in the sort of day-to-day delivery, or indeed, because it goes over often multiple weeks or months, how did they reach those outcomes? How did they use sport as a vehicle in some way? Typically, anyway, I know, of course, we can't speak to any one individual organisation, but how did they typically reach these different educational or employment or otherwise, outcomes, using sport as the sort of catalyst for that change?
Yeah, so primarily that they are advertised as what's known as a low threshold service. So they don't typically say we're here to stamp out heroin use or ensure someone can get into further education or employment. It's largely, in a lot of cases, depending on the programme, marketed as a sports-based programme. And that's used as a sort of a primary hook to get a number of different service users or a number of different people from multiple different backgrounds involved in the organisation. And typically, from what I've observed, is there is a number of drop-in sessions, come in and play sessions, and that's where the beginning of strong relationships built on trust, built on mutual shared experiences of trauma or substance misuse or been involved in the criminal justice system can happen between coaches and players. And then that then relates to working with other services or being involved in more structured programming towards education and employment, or working with other services to ensure that person isn't involved in drugs or has open access to housing, so then further development can materialise. So the long and short of it is sport is used as a hook where relationships can be developed, and then more formalised education or development can occur after that.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose bringing it in now to the conversation towards coaches, before actually we rewind a little bit, because you've already mentioned the word trauma, and I know this makes sort of a large part of your work, and understanding who exactly is in front of you if you are that coach that's delivering on that programme. But it seems like, and from a lot of the reading around your research, that these programs can be so well structured, but they will live or fall depending on the person who is delivering it, and maybe the relationship that they build with the people who are on the program. Now, that's where the coaches in this space, if I'm inferring this correctly, are just paramount then to the program achieving the outcomes that it wishes to achieve. We speak a lot around, and a lot of the benefits of these sorts of programs that I've been reading on through your work is, the fact that it's a community and that it's seen as non-judgmental, the fact that it's somewhere for people to share and empathize with one another, and that's that human touch to it, isn't it? So, you know, you can probably speak to that better than me. How important is the coach for achieving these outcomes within these programs?
Yeah, as you say, is the word that you used is paramount, in a sense that they create the culture. So even in a number of pieces of my research, it's all about the culture created by the coach, and that's what then translates the positive or the negative outcomes to the wider world. So in the first instance, in a large case of it, you have coaches who might have previously been participants in the program, have maybe been through substance misuse or mental health issues, or been through the criminal justice system. And then when a new person walks through the door, they get an understanding of who that individual is and go, oh, you've been through the criminal justice system, that's X person's expertise, or you've had issues in the past with heroin, that's Y person's area of expertise. And they would say that it's a university of adversity, that they've got the checks and balances of what it's like to have lived experience in that. And that's where a lot of the quote unquote coach education comes from for the programs I've worked with. It's seen of high standing if you've got those experiences and in a large part came through the other end and are able to speak to it in a way that doesn't cause re-traumatization and can get people opening up and coming out of their shell and getting involved in the program and can speak to a shared experience of trauma. And then the basis of this trauma-informed work, what we're trying to move towards is, well, how can we do that in an optimal way that doesn't cause significant issues? How can we do it in a meaningful way where people don't return to those experiences, and in a sort of a non-judgmental environment? And even in a sense, when we look towards things like the Homeless World Cup and speaking to them about the role of coaches across different parts of the world and in different cultures, the coach is navigating a tightrope of, my behaviours will ultimately cause potentially a culture towards positive and sustainable development, or I can fall into the competitive ethos as a coach, force this too much, and then that can lead to, as we know, to things like binge drinking on the last night of the tournament, to self-harm, to re-traumatization, to returning to psychiatric institutions in the aftermath of the event, which is not in its entirety caused by coach behaviours, but can be influenced by the role of the coach in these events. So unlike, say, in the sort of a general population of coaching practice or in elite sport coaching, where there's not there is always going to be positive and negative outcomes associated with your behaviour, it's such more of a sort of a knife edge for, in a lot of cases, for sport for development, depending on who you're working with and the role of what your organisation is.
And I think that speaks to me the huge importance and requirement therefore for anyone who works in these spaces. And again, there's programs out there that host for a multitude of different purposes. There are still sports for development programs if it's getting people back into work, or if it's helping like asylum seekers, you know, who have just came into a new country, how they can adapt and assimilate to a new culture, to helping people who, as you say, are homeless. That it's twofold. The consequence if we get it wrong is so big at times, because it really is impacting their life directly, and the sport isn't as such the hobby, because the sport is a remedy perhaps to some of the situations that they're finding themselves in. That coaches in these spaces need a framework, they need help and support. And I wanted to now maybe try and talk through some things that I think could be really helpful for them that comes out of your research, which has been really interesting to read, because I know a lot of your work has been ethnographic in nature. You've been embedded inside these contexts, got to know these contexts, and got to understand what works, and what is just written on paper and it sounds very lovely and rosy, and actually in reality just isn't fit for purpose. So we can chat about all those different things. If you'll humour me, Jordan, then can we maybe start with, talk to us about trauma? Because I think if we start with trauma and understanding what trauma is, then we can move from, okay, understanding more for those that are listening who maybe already do work in these spaces, or indeed maybe they want to work in these spaces, to understand who's in front of them before then they start to then connect that to what they need to do. And then we can come back to talking about, you know, some other parts of your work that will help with some behaviors that are growth minded and so on. So what is trauma? Because we all hear about it. Everyone probably has a bit of a simple understanding of it in their heads. But what's your understanding of trauma?
Very broad question. So my understanding of it, where my research is focused on it, is in terms of literacy growing, is around ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, or what's referred to in a more clinical sense as cognitive and developmental trauma. So this is usually a number of intertwined negative events that you experience in childhood, which can also inhibit your development into and through adulthood. And largely from my research in Scotland and the USA, it's married quite closely with socioeconomic inequality. So if you think of a divorce and an affluent family, they have perhaps the social, emotional, and financial resources in a lot of cases to deal with that. But if we do it in a divorce and perhaps a Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation 1, which is the top 10% most deprived areas of Scotland, that divorce then leads to perhaps loss of housing and potentially homelessness, to negative coping strategies because they don't have the social resources. So that could be around things like alcohol or substance misuses and so on. So if you're witnessing that as a young person, there's a likelihood that one aspect of trauma is then grown into 1, 2, 3, 4. So for example, you've witnessed a divorce, might be around domestic violence, but then the criminal justice system is involved, which you've also witnessed violence, and then you might have seen drugs and so on. And obviously this isn't inextricably linked to social class. It exists across class spectrums, but we know from the research that if you are less affluent and you're from a deprived community, that one experience of trauma then has a greater chance of growing into 2, 3, 4. And then we know that 4 or more instances of trauma, if they're intertwined and they're allowed to manifest, that really prohibits and prevents your growth to be involved in a traditional society of education, employment, positive relationships. So what we want to do in terms of the roles of coaches and sport for development and the roles of other organisations, whether it be education, employment, healthcare, social settings, is be more trauma informed, understanding where did this behaviour come from, how do we plan to deal with it, what is my role to ensure that I'm not adding the burden to this individual.
So if I'm reading you correctly, then so trauma exists on a spectrum. It sometimes isn't about, it can be about the potency, but at other times it can be an accumulative effect. So we need to maybe, is that correct? Because it sounds like, you know, it could be a smaller thing, but one that's maybe not as typically associated with the more large term of trauma, but it's accumulative. And again, if it's not treated correctly, it seems to have this effect.
Yeah,
Is that, yeah?
it's definitely more complex, because one thing that's traumatic for one individual can be not traumatic at all for another. So it could be that siblings, for example, experience trauma in completely different ways, even after being subjected to the same experiences in childhood. And then that can obviously manifest and develop into adulthood. And that's how people can exist differently after experience of trauma. And then that has implications for how people can heal through trauma as well. So it's definitely accumulative, but it's very sad to see, because if you do experience one instance of trauma, and if you are from a disadvantaged space, one can quickly become two can quickly become 4, and then we have quite an apathetic criminal justice system, or our views towards people that have substance issues and so on is quite it's very without empathy. So
Mm.
then, if you've seen someone that's been through all of this and now has heroin issues and so on, we would then traumatize them, and break them for those things that they're using to soothe themselves through trauma. And
Mm.
then that's how people end up going to third sector organisations that have these welcoming spaces that say, "Oh, you've had experiences of heroin use. We have X, Y, and Z people here who've got those experiences, and do you know what? They're coming through the other side of it. They're able to speak to it in quite a positive sense of what the program's been able to do. And there's a lot of experiences when I've seen that with the role of the coach has been, yeah, that's all right. In fact, I've been through that as well. So do you want to come in, sit down, have a cup of tea, and we'll talk about it, rather than it be let's go and kick a ball about. A
Mm.
large part of these programs is sport is just used as a social vehicle where people are able to meet the same place at a fairly irregular time and able to have a chat in a space that's welcoming and non-judgmental.
Yeah, I find it really interesting as well. You don't touch on any one specific cause because it's the interaction of these different issues coming together. Because I know a lot of the stuff in your work, Jordan, uses a sort of ecological framework of, trauma is not experienced in any one vacuum. It's not in a silo, but it's the combination of what's happened and who the person is with, where they're situated, all these other factors, family issues, all things coming together. And it also seems therefore requirement of the coach then if in these programs in these spaces to attack these issues from a multitude of different angles as well, which must take a lot of skill from the coach and therefore now I wonder if we can perhaps move the conversation onwards but sidewards to these what I'm reading as the 4 R's of trauma informed intervention. Is this the right time to maybe speak to that? Of how we can use that now within program design, if we now understand what trauma is, where it comes from, the impact it can have on someone, if not directly, then indirectly through other things. What is the 4 R's of a trauma informed intervention and what relevance do they have to these sports for development programs and the coaches' practice within them?
Well, what we're actually seeing now is people moving towards the more SAMHSA approach to trauma informed practice. So using things like power differentials, participation, voice, and choice. So choosing trauma informed frameworks to understand, well, how do I minimise power differentials between me, the athlete, or for example, the research, the people that you work with as a researcher. How do I take historical or gender-based issues into it? And how do you actually see that trauma exists in that individual? So thinking with trauma, so what is the experiences that individual's had, um, and bringing that to the fore. So actually thinking that someone's been through that. I haven't actually visited the 4 R's in quite a while, but what
Oh,
we're
okay.
actually seeing just now is a move, and it's quite popular in terms of North America, is I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's a mental health and substance abuse charity in the United States, which is now informing a lot of work in research methods in terms of how we gain we elicit data from people that experience trauma to elite sport coaching practice. I know there's been a lot of research in this in terms of youth gymnastics, in terms of, well, how do we make, after some of the historical cases of trauma existing in youth gymnastics, of how do we then move through that and using the SAMHSA approach as a framework, and then also in broader physical activity and coaching practice as well.
So that, I mean, that's really interesting. So that, I suppose that shows where the learning from your sort of work isn't just applied within these more classical spaces or sport for development programs, but that almost sounds like trauma informed coaching is also there to serve maybe the reintegration of athletes within existing, if it's performance settings. Is that the case then? Because where there's been cases, gymnastics, other sports, and can it be about, if not trying to reintegrate, at least try to help with their recovery, if that's even the correct word? I know the language is important here.
Yeah, it certainly is, but it's bringing it's Yeah, it definitely could be. Imagine returning to a sport where you've been highly successful, but in and through the sport that gives you such a good vehicle for competencies and development, so on, is also an area and a domain where you've experienced quite a lot of trauma. So how, as you say, reintegrate someone to that environment without re-triggering or returning to that trauma. So just some of the sort of trauma-informed principles to bring up is paramount of safety, trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. So how do you create an environment where that individual who's experienced trauma has an element of autonomy and empowerment in their own decision making, has an environment with trust individuals involved, where they feel paramount, obviously being a lot of safety, and that can look and exist differently depending on who's involved in that environment. So in terms of some of my outputs that have come out recently, it's all been based around these approaches in terms of what can these organisations do to maintain these principles, and particularly the most relevant ones to these organisations, and then what can researchers do in terms of how do we go in and elicit data from someone who's experienced significant and intertwined experiences of trauma without triggering or re-traumatizing that individual by going, oh, you've been through something that's really, really difficult, that's really, really hard to talk about and can make you feel really uncomfortable. Let's talk about it. So how do we go through that with leaving a very, very delicate footprint? And even on the other side of it, how do you take someone through that journey again, but use it as a vehicle for some catharsis where they can move on from it going, I was able to go through this again. I was able to, in a safe environment, I was able to make sense of it again in a safe environment, and I'm happy to move on where that's been. So the opposite being, you don't want to be, as a coach or as a researcher, going into these domains and being like a bull in a china shop, just looking to shake things up and cause a different stimulus, because in the end it can have serious repercussions for those involved. So even looking at some of the things of the Homeless World Cup Foundation, I believe that the Homeless World Cup Foundation is doing a marvelous job in terms of what they do across the world. But in terms of some of the domestic organisations and few individuals, they're very, very well intentioned and they want people to go to these events and do very well. But within that, they lose the developmental ethos of it and they become less trauma informed. They think to themselves of, let's go here and let's come back with a trophy. That's what our nation is associated with. We'll go and we'll win this. What that ends up being is that can really be triggering to someone of a fear of failure. Failure reminds them of the negative, the bullying in school or how they were subjugated to abuse or neglect as a child. And that can really be harmful and the detriment of those involved, not just while they're at the event, but long after the event has finished as well.
So that, I mean, and that makes me think now in terms of the training that's probably required for people who are indeed going into these programs, where perhaps just, I know that there's also a demographic of coach who will work in these spaces, these sort of sports for development spaces, but maybe they themselves haven't had as harrowing a background sometimes as what oftentimes the participants in these programs have had. But is it therefore then very important that they, not only in terms of teaching self-empathy, that they do they need to deliberately try and throw out prior knowledge of what coaching is about, or perhaps the coaching that they've seen? Because I'm now thinking, right, I've came from that sort of apprenticeship of learning where I've been a player, and maybe I've had and very fortunate that I was to have a very stable upbringing and didn't necessarily experience anything like a lot of these people have. But I therefore went into a coaching space and I've experienced coaching on terms that are very more conventional. It's maybe, yeah, about fun and whatever, but there's a competitive element, and therefore the risk of getting it wrong in that space with me isn't is risky as perhaps of another person. But if I then apply my coaching journey and treat the coaching process as being the same, even if I'm trying with all good intentions to think of the person differently, that sounds like we could still get into some issues because, like you've said, it's not the same coaching process.
Yeah, I think if you're an elite sport coach and you're coming well intentioned and have empathy and care, as a sort of a baseline, you would still do very well, I would imagine. But it's maybe not been aware of what meets you. I think we were all quite naive in terms of the beginning of my PhD of what it was going to be like. We really wanted to go in and develop a coach education intervention in terms of here's how we're looking to change coaching behaviours or to enhance coaching behaviours to optimally develop life skill strategies for coaches. And what we found was we had to strip it all back. It was all more about trauma. So it was moving towards, oh, well, we need to perhaps move back to the deficit reduction strategies of old, which was, do we actually have to remove some of these issues first in an empathetic style before we can move towards positive development or life skill development or whatever aspect you're looking to move towards? So I think the people that go into these programs obviously love for employment and volunteering in terms of a coaching perspective. I think they will be explicitly aware of what they're going into. Many of these programs have it up front what their role is making positive changes through football. So I think when you look at it, and I think even if you look laterally in the United Kingdom or Scotland right now, you see that things aren't going necessarily to plan, and you can kind of see some of the issues coming out. So I think everyone's vastly aware who largely a lot of the service users are at these programs and perhaps what their needs are. But if you don't possess that empathy, or you don't understand the backgrounds of many of these individuals, I think you'll either burn out very quickly or you'll be humbled very quickly, and you learn. Because I'll even say the program that I went to for the first time in 2017 was 2 miles from my grandparents' doorstep, and I didn't have a clue what some of the adversities were. So I think in some senses we can be quite privileged, and we don't even necessarily see what's going on our own doorsteps, or even to the extent of which it's happening. So I think if you are coming from a non-traditional sport for development background, you'll have to learn very quickly and adapt, or maybe it might not be before you.
Yeah, I know completely, and I could see that actually as a real development opportunity for any coach or anyone who does enter that space. That, because you're so correct, like there's that sort of hidden poverty, and you know, even if you're in an affluent area, you've just said that, you know, yards away there can be the most abject poverty you could imagine, and the most different life experiences that exist that just seem unfathomable from where you're standing. So so yeah, it sounds like there is a lot of learning to be had there. And I would wonder again, and it's interesting you'd mentioned around the programs themselves sort of advertising themselves in a way. But I'm saying advertised. How, and this, does I wonder if this has relevance? How do participants on these programs come to find themselves on them? Because I would imagine how you find yourself in the door is going to have an influence on how perhaps the people who are on the other side are trying to work with you. So is this prescribed? Is there voluntary participation in this? And should that matter? I'm wondering for the coach there too, is a starting point. Because it sounds like we need to get to know the individual. Because you know, we spoke already around like that great example you're giving with the World Cup. You know, making things too competitive, and that doesn't solve anything. Same way, maybe you're working with a person, you know, who's the lowest self-esteem in the world because they've never felt like they won at anything, in which case that could offer a sense of validation. So it seems to come from an element of trust and getting to know the person. And I would wonder, does knowing how they've ended up there, like administratively, does that also perhaps have merit?
You know, definitely as well. So many individuals. So in terms of the cross-sectional work that I've done and seeing experiences unfold, largely it happens quite organically of word of mouth, or it can be advertised in hostels. You can be referred through housing, through substance rehabs, or you could be referred through GPs, or a lot of these programs, and if you think now as well, are if you think Street Soccer Scotland, it's on subways, it's on televisions, it's in the streets, it's on the news. I think around about when you think about Christmas Day, Street Soccer Scotland's always on Sky Sports News in terms of look at what we're doing in terms of Christmas Day for some people that don't have a place to go on Christmas Day. So they're so readily available, and the Homeless World Cup has a movie on Netflix now. So, but in terms of the service users that attend, it's usually quite organic. It's in the peer groups of housing services, addiction services, of youth centres or social work or whatever it may, prisons. The amount of individuals that leave the criminal justice system and then attend as their first port of call. It does seem for a lot of people as a safe space or the place to go to get some support. But in a large case of it, it's usually someone has said, I've gone through something similar to you, and I've gone through this, and I've then went to this program, or I'm 6 months down the line in terms of my substance misuse journey or my criminal assistance journey. I think this would be good for you. And in a lot of cases as well, it's things like social workers in one of the narratives of one of the Homeless World Cup papers, it's a social worker buys someone a football and says, you're enjoying yourself in the park, why don't you go to Street Soccer Scotland? And that girl then says she got a hug at Street Soccer, and it was the first hug she'd had in months. So it's that it's very organic, and it's the benefit of that low threshold. It's positive change through football. It's not let's come down and have a talk about your addiction issues, or let's come down and talk about that trauma you faced. It's very much organic and unfolding. I think the longer you're able to engage in these programs, potentially the better it will be for you. And then there are some people that haven't experienced such significant trauma that go as a very swift catalyst into their next job and go and return every so often for a kickabout and can share their story of what it did for them. So in some cases it can be quite clinical, and in cases of a strict referral of this would be good for you, but in a lot of cases it can be quite organic and through word of mouth.
Just some of your research, Jordan, is integrating self-determination theory within it, and of course that deals a lot with, as a starting point, why does someone bring themselves into an activity, and what reasons do they attach for their participation within that activity? And I've read into some of your work where perhaps sometimes with the people who are involved and as recipients of these sports for development programs, that there's a sense of helplessness or a certain passivity that I would imagine then the coach has to kind of work around. And I suppose, is it a case of trying to, where perhaps the initial motivations are more external, or if it's not external, something that's been prescribed to someone, they might not need to go, but there's an external incentive for them to go to that. And of course, we always tend to find outcomes tend to be best when it becomes more and more internalized. And I just wonder, is this again, if we're thinking about what are the aims of coaches in these spaces, are they trying to, if someone's not already bringing themselves forward in a way that is very intrinsic and very, they at least see the value in it, is it about trying to help them understand the value in it? Because I would imagine a lot of people come to this and they feel like they're a lost cause. Is that true? How do we work with that? I'm just wondering.
I don't know, and I think it's actually very complicated in terms of there was some people in my research that had been going to Street Soccer Scotland for 9 years, and then there were some people that were there that was their first month. But we use self-determination theory as a mediator framework for understanding the effects of transformational leadership. And what we found was all the differentiated behaviours would positively predict autonomy, competence, relatedness. But what we found was autonomy wouldn't really do anything in terms of transmitting positive effects to the wider world. And what we can kind of say it likens to that helplessness of, if you do not have structure, or you've got a drop-in session at a program on a Tuesday and a Thursday, you've got certain appointments throughout the week that you need to maintain, but other than that, you've got free reign of your life. It might not, or no sort of a autonomy. More autonomy isn't going to potentially be beneficial at that current time, especially if your life's pretty chaotic. Relatedness didn't probably have the effects that we thought it would. It would sort of negatively predict the outcome variables of life satisfaction and resilience. And we made sense of that being, if you can go to a program where there's going to be 100 people attending a drop-in session, and you've got really strong relationships with maybe the coach or mentor that you're working with, and then several of the men and women that are there that have shared some of their experiences to you, and then you go to the Clyde side is to sleep rough, or you go to a very clinical psychiatric institution, or you go to a hostel, which can be quite a difficult place, depending on the hostel you're going to. You're then just reminded of the fact of, I don't have any relationships here, but I do street soccer, so that makes you feel less satisfied with your life outside of the program. But what we did find was competence was a good transmitter of the positive effects of the coach outside of the program, because these are largely, I don't want to speak too flippantly, a sort of a paint with a broad brush, but on a lot of occasions, if you've experienced trauma or you're engaged in homeless charities, you're probably told that you aren't good enough, that you aren't effective, that you can't make positive contributions to society. When I speak to a lot of the people that engage in these services, they are bright, brave people that can really have a positive touch on changing people's perspective towards things like addiction issues, homelessness, mental health issues, being involved in the criminal justice system, because they have a very, very meaningful story to tell. They've got lived experiences that some of us just probably couldn't deal with, and a lot of them can tell it in a very eloquent way that could have sort of a very broad ramifications for practice and policy in Scotland. So they are very competent individuals, but they probably haven't been told that or reminded of that when they're in addiction services. Again, sweeping sort of a statement, in addiction services or sleeping rough in the street. They're usually berated and traumatized for these experiences and made to feel less than the general population. So that experience of competence and feeling purpose at the program is a really good transmitter for the positive effects of the coach to the wider world.
And is that key then? Because I'd assume if anyone who hasn't, and as you'd mentioned earlier on about the benefits, and you've done, and there's two bits of research there just for those that are listening, just to kind of plug them in, because you've done work where it was a cross-sectional study, and I think it was about 159 participants. It was all self-report, and you were trying to figure out if these transformational leadership behaviours have an impact on life satisfaction and resilience. John, that correct? And we've seen self-determination theory as a way of being able to show what mediates that relationship. But you'd also spoke a little bit briefly there around when you're working with people in different spaces and what the coach can offer. And part of what the things that was useful from your ethnographic work was that if they experienced some, not necessarily trauma, but trauma and whatever part of the spectrum that they might have placed themselves on within that, does that help to, when we're talking about why competence might have been found as a mediator, does that help to sort of flatten that hierarchy? Because I would wonder, as soon as you speak, I'm trying to imagine if I put myself in the shoes of someone who's had really unfortunate circumstances, and you're sitting chatting to someone who, as soon as they tell you what they do, because we attach a lot to what we do, as soon as they tell you about maybe how they act, how they talk, straight away there can be social status games happening there, and I wonder if that can get in the way of trying to, as you say, get them to start to see that they're good at something, get them to start to feel that they can be efficacious at something, that they're capable of then, bringing themselves out of whatever hole they've found themselves in. Is this where these two bits of research you've done that seem separate come together? Because that's really interesting that you found that competence, and then you've mentioned about what the profile of the people who do these programs is.
Yeah, definitely. So there was two sort of empowering, if we could sort of marry these two things, two sort of empowering behaviours or effects that were beneficial for the street soccer players, and that was largely around competence and high performance expectations. So high performance expectations was a direct effect, the only direct effect between coach behaviours and outcomes outside of the programme. And largely we say that around the fact of, again, these are people that are told that you can't achieve anything. You've came from a poor background, you've had all of these experiences, you will be treated a lot less than people in the general population. So in large fact, you won't contribute much to society, but then they go to a place that they're told they can go and do things that they can go on and achieve, and that can definitely have a positive outcome for these individuals that engage in these programs. But to return to your point about competence, it flattens that sort of a power differential between perhaps someone that's university educated, and I was berated for the fact that I was there representing the university, of look at you taking your notes, look at it, and it was, I don't think I would have been able to coach competently there, largely because of who I am, my reflexivity, and my educational background. I would have given it a good go, but I don't think I would contribute as effectively as someone that's maybe went through negative, had experiences of trauma, been able to largely learn from it, and then be able to use that to shorten power differentials from someone, which they would say is just a year or two behind them. So they wouldn't say of, I'm the coach, you're a service user. If someone had perhaps been through an addiction background, they would use sort of a vernacular around the fact of, I'm just 6 months ahead of you. I'm just a year down the line. Keep doing what you're doing. You can get through this, largely if everything goes to plan, and you can find yourself in education and employment if things go the right way. So it was never a fact of large power differentials between service user or coach. It was very much seen as there's only time separating us. If you want to work hard, if we can support you and you allow us to support you, there's nothing that could hold you back potentially to moving toward more positive horizons.
So you can see that. I'm thinking now in terms of, that seems like a conscious thing that perhaps coaches who are working in this space could be doing, where they are trying to offset that power differential by, at all times showing a humility of where they're currently at, and they're just, as you say, on the same journey, but maybe at a different level. If they haven't necessarily experienced trauma and that, and to the extent that these participants have as well, being conscious of things like how you speak. I'm wondering, there must be a lot of emotional intelligence involved if you're working with any demographic, and I don't want it to sound patronising of saying with a demographic that's more, came from a more working class, socially, economically deprived background, because as there can be people from all walks of life that could be in front of you, but I could imagine, and I think it's something I try myself, even outside of, and being a coach who doesn't operate in that specific space, I know that if I'm working even with young kids, young boys, it's not going to serve me well to speak and use a vocabulary that runs the risk of maybe someone not being able to understand what I say, or to get a sense that I feel superior in the way that I say it. And I do think there's a real skill set in having a bit of a chameleon effect to yourself, where you learn how to assimilate to who's in front of you, and the way that you speak. You can be rougher. Again, I think there's nuance around language. Sometimes a sweary word can be a way of further, integrating yourself with who's in front of you. It just depends. Or sometimes it's not, and you would sit back and you speak more formally. But I do wonder, in your observations of the coaches, did you see that? There must be a real social intelligence, I would imagine. If it's not natural, I just would at least feel it implicitly, of the way they know how to speak to each other, because that could be, you could totally close off anyone to any productive conversation just by how you speak to them. Was that something you observed, or am I totally off? I'm just speculating a little bit here, but it's making me think about things.
Yeah. There was, without sort of giving you too much away to who the coaches were, some of them are very much social architects of their environment from prior to the engagement in the program. So one come from a sort of a criminal justice background and was known for being quite of a sort of a powerhouse of his local area. The same is true for someone else that came from a criminal justice an addiction background as well. These were individuals that had been out and been involved in a few battles, were known to the police, had some scars, and had the sort of a stories to tell from the back of it. So they brought, I think they had the power, they have had the physical presence, they've got the experience of that background, and I think that they were able to recognise some of the issues that they've been through and come through the other side, and were able to be vulnerable. So they're able to say, I've done X, Y, and Z, which was very machismo and could have scored them a lot of social brownie points as that. But then they could say, well, that wasn't too clever because this is then what happened to me as a result. And then they can go full circle and tell you. From my experience of working with all of the coaches, they all brought something completely different to the table, and they all had fantastic stories to tell. And I can remember meeting two coaches literally on my first day of my PhD out for data collection, or starting to prepare for data collection. And the guys had me in the palm of their hand. I was nearly in tears with some of the stories that they were able to tell me, and how they would then use those to move forward and motivate people towards more positive horizons, and also tell you that they were just so disenfranchised with what the world was like around about them and the treatment towards the people that they were working with, because it wasn't doing anyone any favours. So, and then meeting other people as well, even some of the female coaches as well, and they brought a completely different dynamic to it, and they were able to sort of develop relationships with some of the young women coming through as well, and again just absolute powerhouses. And if you look at it from different reflexivities and lived experiences, it's not something I think I would be able to do, because I couldn't be authentic and tell the same stories as some of these individuals were able to do. And I was very much made to feel that way, of the pretentiousness wouldn't have been able to survive that as an ethnographer, of look at you and your laptop, look at you coming and taking your notes. Like, if I was to act pretentious, so I just wanted to be a wallflower and sit there and take on everything that I could possibly take in without, and I would have my opinions asked in coach and practice and what I think people should do. And it was very important for me to go, I think this is different. I think you guys have got this. We're just literally trying to see if we can bottle what user doing, maybe recommend some changes once we've got the data, but keep kind of doing what you're doing, because it seems to be having a positive effect.
So really, I'm really glad you say that, Jordan, actually, because I think it's really great for some people who will be listening who are engaged in research, or perhaps have an interest in doing ethnographic work, because you've been in spaces where your work that is real, particularly if you're working inside, a sport for development context, and you've had to figure out how to assimilate to those spaces, and it's really, really important points you've given. I'd like you to return to that point that you made around, I don't know if it's deliberate or not, or if it stood out to me, where you talk about stories. And it's interesting that, because it seems like the coaches who are in these spaces were great storytellers, and it makes me always think about the power of a story. And I think this, again, perhaps even a lesson not just inside this specific context, but even indeed in community sports settings and performance sport, that a story in a lot of ways can help integrate a lot of different parts together into something that's cohesive and has a emotional component to it, if indeed the storyteller wants it to have that, or it can have a sort of chronology to it as well, which, again, if that serves the purpose of in this space, for example, the end game being of trying to get better and rehabilitation, those sorts of things, it can be felt very, very deeply a story. It can resonate with people, and I think for coaches listening, they should never underestimate the power of their own story and how they can use that to their advantage wherever they're working with a different group of people. Plus, again, it's ecological, isn't it? A story's going to have different parts, different actors, and if we're returning to this specific demographic, if we know that part of their recovery or resilience, and again, coach me a little bit on the language here, because I'm also, my next follow-up question is, what do they talk about? Is the goalpost? Is it about recovery? Is that the word, or is it resilience? But we can use the story towards that, because it's looking at it intersectionally. It's going to bring in lots of different parts together. So it's just a wee bit of a comment. But on that last point, what is the goalpost when they speak about this? What have you found has been useful, or at least that you've found has been common in the way that the people who are delivering these programs and working with this group of people, how do they view things? Is it recovery? Is it resilience? What's the language that's used? Because I've been reading it, but I want to know more about that.
To be
Does
quite
it not
honest,
matter? Is it semantics?
it's not as explicit as that. I think from experiences of being there regularly and observing what's going on, it's a matter of continuing to show up, improving sort of a week by week, by going from a stage of, okay, you've shown up, you've been involved in the drop-in sessions, you became a permanent fixture, you've now told us a little bit of who you are, what you're facing. We're now working with our partners in X, Y, and Z in terms of mental health charities, housing charities, and so on, to get you into a form of multidisciplinary care, because a lot of these charities can't work in isolation because they won't have optimal outcomes. It then moves on to, oh, you've been here for, say, 18 months, you're a permanent fixture, you're a great team player, you're involved in all of these other things to support others. You would be a fantastic candidate to go to the Homeless World Cup. We would like you to go to, it's in South Korea, the next one. We'd like to ship you over to another part of the world to be involved in quite an intense developmental program, and hopefully by the end of it, that's used as a springboard catalyst to fire you into more positive horizons. But returning to your question, there's not an emphasis on recovery. There's not an emphasis of, let's properly sit down and talk about your trauma. It's very much low threshold. It's very much improvement week after week, month after month. And also, when there is moments of, let's actually properly sit down and share some stories, it's based around personal disclosure, mutual sharing of, let me tell you a little bit of what I've been through. And that then really does break down the power differentials of, all right, it is okay for me to be here, or it is okay to kind of experience these things, or to feel annoyed that people look at me in this certain way. Oh, there is a chance of me to battle this or progress through this and so on, and I shouldn't feel a sense of guilt or shame. And
Okay.
there's been countless occasions of, you go, well, such and such person, I was like, he's working, he can't come here. And you go, well, it's a shame I'm not going to see them, but the fact you're not going to see them is they've got themselves a flat full-time job, and they're a completely different person to what they were when you first met them 2 years previously. And it's a testament really to what the organisations do.
So there's the art of sort of masking the formal aspect to the program and not maybe getting too caught up in words like recovery and resilience, and like you said, that low threshold, keep them there and start the conversation. I get that makes a lot more sense to me now. And it doesn't, and perhaps that's a nice segue where you spoke about that nice sort of case of someone now they've left for work, because that's very transformational. So I want to know, what is transformational leadership, because this is, we've covered a little bit about what trauma is, what it can involve, not pigeonholing it as such, because it is quite a complex thing. And now perhaps the listener and indeed those people who already work in these contexts are getting a better sense of who is in front of them. But now how can they be even more effective at what they do beyond, you know, some of the principles of the interpersonal skills we've spoken about, like empathy, assimilation, being conscious of power dynamics and how you can level that, the sort of hierarchy in those ways. What is transformational leadership? Why is it useful? How often do you see it getting used? Let's start to get into that now in terms of in this space. So what is transformational leadership?
So transformational leadership is essentially a behavioural approach to conceptualizing and acting out leadership behaviours. So it's essentially a number of things that we can do that we know relates to X, Y, and Z. It's been validated in a number of different contexts, from parenting to teaching to education to the military and elite sport and sport for development. So it's based around things. I won't break down all of the behaviours, but conceptually they fit into sort of categories of vision, support, challenge. Vision being creating goals and more positive visions of a future desired state. Support being ensuring you provide the necessary support to ensure that vision can materialize, and challenge being that you create a stimulus, you challenge the way people do things to ensure that they can move towards that desired state to go to.
And does that seems to fit well then with that type of group, isn't it? Because it's about changing perspective, it's about being positive, and it's about offering that individual help. Does that seem to be a strength for that framework? It seems very aligned then to its use in this context.
Definitely. So even if you were to break down challenge and you think about intellectual stimulation, which is one of the behaviours that fits within challenge, that would essentially be a coach saying, receiving someone into the program who said, I'm coming from an addiction background. Society's told me that I'm useless, that I went to school and didn't achieve what I wanted to achieve. My life is essentially over at 21 because I've been through some addiction issues and everyone's telling me that I'm no good. And essentially how that works at Street Soccer Scotland is they would sit down with someone and go, well, why is it over? Why can't you go through this? In fact, I've been through some stuff. Do you want to hear about it? Do you want to hear what I've been through and where I am now? In fact, there's 5 or 6 other people over there that have been through something similar. Their life isn't over. In fact, one of them's going to the Homeless World Cup, and another one we'll probably never see again because they're starting a new job in 2 weeks. So that's essentially what challenges is to get people to rethink how they do things, how they think about themselves, and how they can move forward.
And then I suppose when you're talking a little bit about sometimes the people who have been in a similar space and they're now getting better, they're starting to role model. And again, that's quite transformative in itself, isn't it? So, you know, that seems to be another reason why perhaps if you have that prior experience and use it, lean into it. Well, actually, I wonder this. And again, it's maybe quite a tricky question as such, if it's not being said by they themselves, but I wonder where there seems to be a lot of use for using your past experiences if you've perhaps had trauma in your life to help give back to the very sort of programs that have helped you sort of build your life up and keep moving forward. Did you ever speak to some of the coaches and did they ever wrestle with the re-traumatization risks of doing that? Because I'm wondering if you're the person in these spaces who's being asked to role model behaviour, therefore you're needing to, not if you're not needing to, but you may be there's an incentive to maybe go back into your own past experiences. Where is that in the balance, I wonder, of cathartic and that they're able to further grow out of that as they continue to dig into it? But also, because I'm really interested in understanding the mentality of people who have went through things that are really harrowing, but they're so good and kind in what they want to give back that they're willing to talk about that again and again and continue to be in a space where that is in the front of their heads. How do they manage that? Because and I know, again, I'll try and structure this because a lot of thoughts are coming into my head, but when we talk more generally about the coach, who cares for the coaches across coaching spaces, there's a very visceral risk, I suppose, in this space where coaches are also actively putting themselves back into situations that can be psychologically vulnerable for their participant. It's almost like a very context-specific way in which coaches in sports for development programs have risks because of just nature of that work. Did the coaches that you interviewed, did they ever speak to any of that? Or again, maybe this is something we can just speak about ourselves. What's your thoughts on any of that?
There wasn't really any specific instances that I can go into about that, but there is that whole conversation of who makes the clown laugh of, and there is something quite positive now, particularly in sports settings and in sports stars, where we commodify their experiences of trauma. We give them Netflix deals, and it's something I speak to in a sort of a narrative research of not wanting to go into spaces and going, you've been through addiction issues, or you've experienced sexual violence, or you've seen domestic violence, tell me about it. I transcribe that, and then I'm off. And then what I've done is I've created a firestorm of issues, and then just left with a nice story. That can happen, where we put so much value into people's experiences of trauma. We want them to tell it time and time again. We ask them to go to conferences, and we put them on the television and everything else. And as you say, it's a great platform for causing re-traumatization very quickly, or it can be something that can happen over a matter of years. It's just this dull revisiting something that's horrible that you might not necessarily have got over, or it might be to the point where you're doing it so often that you find new trauma from an experience that happened decades ago. I think more really has to be done around, if we are going to gain so much more literacy around mental health issues, experiences of trauma, and kind of encourage people to talk about it and share their story to a broader audience. Okay, that's great, and I wholeheartedly support it. But how do we do it in an optimal way where, one, we're prioritising the individual who's sharing the message, and two, we're not doing it in this commercialised, commodified way where we're just stripping someone and encouraging them to perhaps share something too much more than what they all originally would have, and stripping them of integrity, or we associate that person with their trauma and not with their potential for development. I think that can be quite tricky.
Yeah, just as it's making me you're making me think about the Homeless World Cup, which again, you can educate me on this because I haven't got the greatest knowledge on is that the legacy of the tournaments and what actually happens after it. And it sounds like, fortunately, it does sound like that, the participants who are in these events, that they do go on and get more support. I'm sure there is also cases where perhaps they are a little bit exploited because of the marketization of different things. But going towards thinking back to what we were just saying there around the coaches, who's caring for the coaches, and indeed that becomes even more important in these spaces when we consider the background of a lot of the people who work in these spaces. Is there, in your view, adequate training or support for the people delivering these programs? What is the state of play there? This is tricky. We're talking about quite a high level transformational leadership, if indeed it's I don't know how prevalent it is. Maybe you can tell me to that as well. Do you see these behaviours happening a lot in these programs? And if they do, or if they don't, do the people who are carrying the behaviours forward, are they assisted in their own way to help to that? So can we get into that a little bit?
Quite similar. I didn't do much research on that specifically, but what I'm aware of, sort of anecdotally, was there was support. There was a mentoring system involved within the program, in the program, in a sense of, if you are having such difficulty, there was one particular member of staff who was in a more senior position, who was always, they all kind of, it was interesting when I was working with coaches, because they all kind of very positively spoke about each other behind each other's back, And I said, so if I've got something that's going on, I'm not quite happy with it, I go to X person, and then X person would talk about Y, and ABC would sort of a group together, and they go, well, if I'm dealing with a difficult time in terms of even my sobriety, or I'm really worrying about a participant to the point where it's having an issue with my own mental health, I have someone that I'll go to. And I don't know how structured or unstructured it was, but it was abundantly clear that was happening, which is great to see, because essentially these aren't just coaches, they're social workers, they're counsellors, they're addiction support workers, they're working in homelessness and housing. They basically sit across a number of social issues that we either have created as a society or allowed to go on as a society, and they are essentially on the front line of a lot of the stuff that we sweep under the carpet or don't are too afraid to look at. And I think that, yeah, they definitely deserve more support to ensure that they can deal with it.
Yeah, because as I say, if we don't have the evidence as such to speak to it further, it seems like a very important conversation to just raise. Because without even having stepped foot in one of these spaces, I bet the best coaches in these spaces are some of the best coaches you can get anywhere, because that's a very complicated role, where so much can go wrong. And I would just think, yeah, and that does sound like, of all the spaces that coaches need further support, I could assume it's this one, in order to look after ourselves as the carers. So no, it's just really interesting. I suppose that one of the things to stick on transformational leadership for now as well is because I've noticed you spoke a little bit around the need to think positively. And I know one of the behaviours within transformational leadership is this idea of inspirational motivation and how they can look towards the future. Does that align? Because earlier on you mentioned about not seeing things in a deficit view. But what is, just did you help clarify for us, what is a strength-based approach to coaching versus a deficit-based approach to coaching, and why does that matter, and why should we care about that if perhaps we're entering into these sorts of spaces, a sport for development space? What is it about that slight change that is perhaps really important?
Yeah, so a deficit reduction paradigm could be when you're explicitly looking at a problem. So if you say, for example, you are marketing a physical activity program for individuals with obesity, the research is probably clear that that wouldn't necessarily work, because you are viewing people as problems that need to be fixed. So, for example, if you went into it and going, you're overweight, this is having so much impact on your health, and more broadly, think about the strain you're putting on the NHS and so on, or whatever else, it's not going to have positive or sustainable implications for that individual. So if you revert that to a more strength-based approach of, like, or even a low threshold approach of, let's get in, let's get involved, let's go and do something that's good for us, let's try and repeat it regularly, and let's build widespreading ripples into more better eating habits and whatever else, and you market it more so towards that, where it's more organic and grows more broadly, that's probably going to have a more sustainable basis for development. So how that works within street soccer, a sport for development more broadly, is not viewing individuals as problems based on their socioeconomic status, their health background, where they're from, the experiences that they've got, but rather seeing them as people that have the capacity to do good things, that they have innate strengths within them, say contributions to other people and organisations and to society. Let's see if we can hone in on them, refine them and develop them, and then hopefully send them on their way so they can materialise in that development.
Okay, no, that makes a lot more sense. So, because again, I would imagine there could be the risk as well of that self-fulfilling prophecy. If I come in as the coach and I just see you as a criminal, or as a, these other terms that aren't always friendly, like junkie and different words like this, that we and in many ways we get, society asks us to say these things, and it seems to be something that's accepted. that's just going to turn that person off. They might actually then indeed be more likely to exhibit behaviour towards you that's less responsive, that actually starts to paint them in the same light as what you initially just assumed they were like. So it's like they become what you treat them like, and
Yeah.
that's not going to help. So that we must really need to pay attention to that if we're working in this space.
Yeah, societies, like from my experience, and even from looking at things in terms of a lot of our governments do, in terms of what a lot of the politics is turned into, in terms of views towards marginalised, victimised, or trauma experienced communities, say across the board. So you use the word junkie, and that's it's such a powerful statement in a sense of, if you chastise that individual because of the circumstances they're faced, you are slowly but surely forcing that person back to the thing that you're chastising them from. And that's something that and that's that if that word was used at the program, it would be a sort of a mic drop moment of that just isn't said here. That just isn't that isn't language that we use here. So that kind of moves back to that whole non-judgmental environment. And even if it was to be used flippantly, which it is used across the board, it's something that I would certainly sort of try and clamp down on. But but the other side of it is it's we should sort of use these words and teach people about these words, because it is vernacular that we hear readily in broader society. But even if you look across our views towards refugees or people that are less affluent, it's very we berate them, we chastise them, we stigmatise them, and that does nothing for us, but only forces those individuals back towards the self-soothing, the coping strategies that we chastise them for in the first place. So it's not, language is important. It's not about even just educating people about it. It's just try not to say it. Try and be a bit more empathetic. And even if you want to do it from a more, I don't know, a more agency approach, just think to yourself, if I use that word to stigmatise someone, I'm just going to see more of it, because that's what the result of me saying that word is.
Yeah, 100%. And with the sort of nuance I think you've alluded to there, where it depends on the individual relationship that you have with that person, because indeed sometimes certain words in a trusting relationship can be good for tearing down boundaries, but other times, if that trust isn't there and there isn't indeed agency on the person who that word's aimed towards, or an equivalent word is aimed towards, that agency hasn't been respected, it's not going to do anything. I wonder, therefore, because we know that, I mean, I personally don't really believe this idea that politics and sport should exist separately. I don't think it can. I think politics is in everything. Sport's a political weapon in a lot of ways as well. But I wonder about the role then of coaches who are in sport for development programs, not as a obligation, because again, I don't think anyone should be obligated to put themselves out there and so on and so forth. But I would wonder about the motivations for when you go and coach in these spaces, that there's something that is innately political around it. You are trying to will forward a social enterprise that's based on societal mistakes and issues, and people that have been mistreated and judged and stuff like that. And I just would be curious to know your view on the coach is a almost a political, I don't know if weapon's the right word to use, but is the coach in these spaces, is it as much about marketing the work as it is about doing the work? Because you need to get the voice out there about the work shouldn't be needed, but it is needed now, and we need to continue, to resource these programs. I'd be interested to know what's your understanding and of just the kind of health of these spaces. Are they backed properly, these programs? Are they do the coaches within these programs, is there a loud voice from those actors in trying to will forward society? What's your feeling around some of that stuff?
It's interesting because the work that these organisations do are obviously fantastic, really well intentioned, and do have an impact. But the fact that there's so many of them is indicative of feelings of the sort of a public sector. I won't get into it far too much, but the growth of the third sector is inextricably linked to the fact that other services aren't being as funded as well. Community centres, sports spaces, schools, NHS, other services around health and social care. That's the reasons why a lot of these services exist. And I've worked very briefly with the CEOs and sort of the real social architects at the top of these programs, and they're very much apolitical. I think that from my experiences, even when there is really sort of a high-reaching conferences or presentations these individuals have to do, it's very much focused on, rather than the role that they do in-house, I think they understand very much where they're situated, the growth of their organisation, what they can do, and working then with the coaches in these organisations. I think they just know what their role is, what they have to do. I think there is conversations of they understand that it's not a good thing that their numbers are potentially so high, and that the adversities that are coming through, the people that are experiencing such complicated adversities more now, especially after things like COVID, is indicative of broader issues. But it's never a conversation that's really been had. It's more around the fact of I've got, say, 60 people coming in 45 minutes, and I've got to do my best with what I've got in the situation that I'm able to do it within. And that was my role in terms of my conversations with them. Perhaps if I sat down with them and spoke to them more broadly, like, what do you, and I would love to sit down with them now and ask them, what do you think is going on with this? What do you think the future is of this? Because it's good to see these organisations reach such a good number of people, which means more people are probably aware of these organisations existing. But is it just the sad fact that it's just because the societal issues are becoming more rampant?
Yeah. And again, I think it'd make for an interesting research project probably, and there's a lot of people that might be listening who have an interest in this, and perhaps that's an area they could delve into themselves. But yeah, because I think the reason I asked that, besides the reasons you've very well communicated, we often separate the conversation of coaching to policy. It's almost like, and we see it in academic circles as well, that it's like treated as a separate area of work. But I think if there's ever a case study for how policy is delivered, it's through coaches in these spaces, because they're instruments of the very system that creates their need to be there, and creates indeed sometimes the reasons for being there as well. And we see that perhaps in the motivations for people who have came from quite unfortunate backgrounds and have been trauma experienced, and then being in these spaces where they're trying desperately to help other people and so on and so forth. But yeah, it just seems like a really important thing to mention. You'd mentioned earlier, Jordan, just I want to return a little bit about the individual experiences that you've recorded in your time that you were there. You'd mentioned a little bit about the female experience. I think it might be useful to turn to that a little bit as well. So there's been female participants in these programs, but also female coaches that you've observed and worked with. What makes that different from the male experience, I wonder? And indeed, because again, there's going to be coaches listening to this that will want to work in these spaces, are already doing. Perhaps they're already faced with some of the challenges that we can now start to talk about that are gendered, and that might be useful to work through.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the coaches that I worked with is really a fantastic individual who's came from an elite sporting background, but intertwined with this sporting background is some substance use, and some instances of trauma, which this coach is eloquently able to share in quite a powerful way, and has coaching experiences as both perhaps a traditional coach and as a coach within sport for development. So she wears many hats and is able to also bring about good conversations with other women. And I think that's necessarily where it comes from as well. And I've experienced this as a researcher, as I've been in an environment with a woman that's experienced trauma, and thinking my presence in this room at this time probably isn't good for this person I'm working with. And then you find that your intuition was correct once you hear more about that individual further down the line. And that's in some of the cases where, from a reflexivity point of view, it's fantastic to get more women involved in it, because the organisation I worked with is becoming, especially over the past few years, has become a lot more popular in terms of its programming with women.
Mm.
But with that, you need to sort of have more female coaches and volunteers involved, because there are experiences where having a male coach and having those dynamics might not be optimal at that point of time. And that can happen with, for example, with young women that have experienced sexual violence, who are in a process of healing after that sexual violence, and quite legitimately don't feel comfortable to have relationships or a close bond with a male coach. So that's one of the reasons of it as well. And also, experiences of trauma can be the exact same for men and women, but also they manifest differently depending on gender. So homelessness in Scotland can be very different in terms of for men and women, because of things of the potentials for sexual violence. Yes, men are likely to experience sexual violence when homeless, but it's likely going to be, you are more vulnerable to that as a female on the streets. So I think being able to speak to that, and regardless of your views of, or it doesn't matter if it's a male coach or a female coach, that's not the argument for me. It's what's the service needs of the individual coming through the door. Is the safety going to be guaranteed by having a female coach? Yes, we need female coaches. We need someone, just like if we had someone coming from an addiction background that has those experiences, or someone coming from a criminal justice background that have got those experiences. It is important that we have gendered experiences, and that needs to be intersected by the sort of a female voice, because those experiences do manifest differently depending on gender.
Yeah, and I suppose it's that whole element of, we may only, I mean, me and you only ever see things through a man's eyes, and that can be very removed from the reality that other people experience. I wonder whether there's probably also cases where indeed differences in gender can help with certain conversations as well. Rightly or wrongly, depending on how a participant sees a woman compared to a man. Is it more open? Is it more caring? Is there, without going into stereotypes and stuff, but nonetheless, they do play a role. They exist within society. These things are there for a reason. They're present. And it's a useful point that you make as well of, are these programs being resourced with the types of people who can speak to, or at least create a welcoming atmosphere and environment for those types of people who are then going to be part of the programs and going to be targeted through the programs. Because I think it's important, and I think it's a really important point you make, and I think it's useful for maybe people who are thinking about where they could maybe put themselves, and maybe they're interested in being a sport for development coach, and indeed they want to go and work with the homeless, but maybe before they go and look at that, think about what are the specific programs that are out there, who is the clientele, and how aligned am I to perhaps being the best person to work with them, without it again being as a barrier, because again, diversity of persons is really helpful and useful for different reasons, but thinking through the eyes of the participants. So it seems that empathy is really important there again. Is it trying to understand the person? I want to, while we're on that, because it's just came out of my head, empathy, again, something we all see is something we all understand, but in its actual operationalization within these programs, is empathy easy? Because I wonder, we've spoke about working with challenging groups. Again, not even the right word to use, disadvantaged groups and people who have came from challenging backgrounds. That can lend itself to interactions that aren't always easy. empathy is something I think as people we have it, but maybe only for so long at different times. It can go up, it can go down. Was there any challenges around empathy that were presented by the coaches who maybe you've worked with or dealt with, or what, just I just would like to talk a little bit around empathy. What's your thoughts on that in relation to this sort of work that you do?
Well, what I seen was it was remarkable to me that the coaches that I worked with, and I'd worked with them over a period of years, was they never, do you know, we can kind of have run out and experience empathy fatigue. I never really seen that happen. I never seen, and this was, and I was, even some of the times I was, what's the parameters here? Like, what's the rules of engagement? And at what point do you just tell someone that you're not to come back? And this was after things like fights, like whatever else. And this is where I was humbled, and I had to learn through the coaches of, we're a service, we provide a service. They come to us, and as long as we can ensure their safety and the safety of others while they're there, and it'll not being a detriment to other people's development, they're here. Rules of it is, don't bring paraphernalia, which would be like weapons, drugs. Don't berate people or chastise people from the different lived experiences of everyone's faced. For example, the use of, I can remember at an event where someone did use the word junkie, and it was quite powerful because it really did annoy a lot of people, and that sparked quite a lot of conversations with me and a coach. But like any sort of not like traditional football and setup, if you go to like a five-a-side parks with 10 people that are the best of friends, and they're there week after week, more often than not there will be a fight at one point. These were some of the things that did happen, but there was a maturity, and there was a lot of the people that did engage with it, because they've been through so many services, were so introspective about why certain things were happening, or if we did see someone just acting out and maybe throwing a tantrum, we would blame them from it, but because they were able to look more broad and go, they're having that because it's a bad time, or they're going through custody battles right now with family, and there was just this level of maturity and this thread of empathy through it, where they didn't justify the behaviour, and meaningful conversations had to be had, but there was an understanding of, some of these people aren't going through the rosiest of times, and we just kick them out, and then that means they don't get our support. No, we maybe have a conversation with them, and we try and get through it to ensure that that person can sustainably engage, and that's what I've seen more often than not.
Yeah, no, it just, yeah, it just brings to the forefront for me the importance of that. I mean, I can speak on empathy in a coaching space removed from this sort of exact environment, but if you're working with any athlete, and I know that these aren't necessarily athletes, that we're speaking to sport participants, or you can use another word for it, but empathy doesn't need to be agreement. You can understand without agreeing with someone, and I suppose if there was ever an environment where a mature understanding of empathy seems required, it's probably the one that you do a lot of the research within, because, and again, it can be applied elsewhere, but if I see an athlete, and I've had this in the past, where, you know what, that player doesn't turn up to practice in time a lot, or that player isn't great at taking feedback, right? Or that player indeed does something, they lash out and they hit their friend. You can disagree with the behaviour, but if you then begin through your understanding of that person, start to think in the way they think, and start to, if I was that person, I have this background, I have this other things going on, I may react in that way. You're going to have a bit more of an understanding, and a bit more, not maybe leeway is a better word, not necessarily acceptance, but leeway around their behaviours. And I would just think, transferring that to this context, anyone who's working in it, of course, the standard customs that we might expect of one another, of course that can go a bit pear-shaped or a bit sideways in environments where people who have never been given a chance at life, who have never been brought up in a way that is functional and helpful for them in society, will never had the luxuries and the privileges that we were afforded to learn certain things and ways of behaving, or they have had a chance to accrue experiences that would help them develop in a way that doesn't land them where they're at. Of course, someone who's in that space is going to act and react to things in a way that's different from how you possibly would. And I just think that's a really important lesson, I think, for coaches to understand. You're not agreeing with them, but understand them. If you've got athletes or sport participants wherever you work, try to understand. Empathy is about understanding. It's not a rosy thing. It can be a very gritty thing. I think this space exemplifies that it's a gritty thing, empathy, and it's tiresome. But again, it's actually amazing that you say that a lot of the coaches didn't seem to have any tire in their empathy. That just speaks to the absolute angels that do these sorts of things. I just think it's incredible. I think they deserve all the support that they can get. One thing I think to end on, I think it's important. And we're trying, Jordan, in this podcast to help people be aware of where the recommendations that they hear that come out of research, where that research and the way that research is conducted, how that should inform the way we take on those recommendations. So I'd like, if you can maybe speak a little bit to not necessarily the findings of your work anymore, we've covered that quite well, but I suppose the way your work was done, how that influences how we take on the findings, where your work sits within a larger portfolio of work and what the current state of that work is, so that, again, we can understand, do we know enough about this space and coaching from an academic side, from an evidence side, to have an understanding of what to do? If we do, great, tell us. But if we don't, how can we still take on the recommendations of work like yourself, like other people, but with that sort of caution in different ways? So it'd be interesting to know a little bit about the evidence base that you're presenting and where that's came from and the stuff, sort of the limits of that sort of thing.
I think in terms of, because we spoke about it quite a lot, transformational leadership. I think that's highly validated. So in terms of, if you are a practitioner, it's abundantly clear that across so many disciplines across sport that it is the thing to be doing. So if you're looking for a framework to base your coaching practice or a pedagogical approach to think about, the evidence is very, very clear, and it's evidence that's grown. It's tend to be conducted really to a really good rigor and so on. So look at the research around transformational leadership, because it is about the things that you can do, the behaviours you exhibit, what's in your control. And I think if it's a starting point, whether you're from an academic background or layperson, have a look at transformational leadership, see what it's related to, what the outcomes are associated with it. If you're a mentor or an educator, particularly if you're in a sort of a NGB background, it's a really there's a high trainability associated with transformational leadership. People tend to learn it, and people are able to transfer it into their current practice.
Is it being used, Jordan? Is it education, military, and business context? It's got a bit more standing there, and it started to come into coaching.
It's started to come into sport coaching practice in sort of early, I think, 1990s and 2000s, and it's steadily grown since. But in terms of education interventions, randomized control trials, everyone's tending to agree what it's associated with: team cohesion, performance outcomes, motivation, extra effort. There are systematic reviews on this, namely from Callum Arthur, that can tell you a lot about the positives associated with it. And it's all abundantly clear in terms of age group, in terms of culture, in terms of languages. People tend to agree it's all pointing to a good direction. More broadly speaking, parenting, education, employment, job satisfaction, the military context, elite paramilitary context, it's across the board where the benefits are associated with it. In terms of sort of my smaller niche area of sport for development, it's all around people's experiences of trauma, socioeconomically disadvantaged individuals, the Homeless World Cup. The research on the Homeless World Cup, though it's been around for a couple of decades now, it's not abundantly clear, and it's quite sparse in terms of what's been explored from paper to paper. I think in my conversations with the Homeless World Cup, it's time to sort of pull this together, streamline it, and see where we can go in terms of how do we optimize the Homeless World Cup, how do we get the Homeless World Cup speaking the same language? Isn't the greatest way to say this, because everyone speaks different languages, but to speak and this, to sing off the same hymn sheet as the domestic organisation, so that everyone's following the same pattern of preparation, the event and aftercare, to ensure everyone's got the best chance of taking the positive implications of the Homeless World Cup to the next area. Other areas for coaching practice is how coaches learn to develop in the absence of sport for development specific coach education. So what are the environments and cultures by which someone learns to be an effective sport for development coach? So namely around places like that university of adversity, learning through and beyond trauma, and then also how do we cater for trauma-informed practices in sport for development? So that's kind of where I am in terms of my research on coaching practice and where I want to move from there.
Yeah, no, brilliant. No, thanks so much, John. I think what you've given here is something that's, again, really tangible, and given a framework that, as you've said, is very validated. It's loose, and I think that's useful as well. That there's a certain there's not a rigidity to it. There's, you know, in those that go on to explore the specific behaviours in more detail, we'll see that there's a fluidity between them and how you use them, and it comes from as you say, a strength-based view on things that's really applicable in this context, but I would dare say that's not useful in other coaching contexts. Why would we not want to have a strength-based approach in performance sport? Why would we not want to have a strength-based support in community sport, working with masters athletes, working with young kids? Why wouldn't you want to think that way? And it's also been highly helpful for those who are more specifically embedded or are interested in the sport for development space to understand trauma better. So I think if you don't know who's in front of you, you won't always know what to do and why you're doing it. And I think what you've given us here is something that we can take away and use, which I just think is invaluable. So thanks so much. And we even go into topics around empathy, what that means, and some of the grittiness around that, and we'll spoke a little bit about the policy and how policies often live through coaches now. And I think that starts a conversation that, look, we ask questions that neither of us can really answer, but it's important that we start asking questions in that space. I think your work is very much, it's a very adult conversation in coaching, and it's about looking at beyond the sport. Just sometimes coaching isn't about the sport, it's not about the technical, not about the tactical. I would say Jordan's space, for those that are listening, isn't the only space that we need to stop thinking so much about that as well. And I just think it's really important, some of the things that we've touched on. Thanks as well for giving us a wee bit, John, around your evidence and where that's coming from. I'll put a link in this episode, guys, for anyone that's wanting to read Jordan's work. He communicates his research really well. And actually, for those who are budding researchers and perhaps are interested in actually how do you do research in this space, a lot of Jordan's ethnographic work really helps understand what you'd be getting yourself into, and understands things from quite a deep philosophy of thought about care and looking after people. And again, look, I think even as a coach, go and steal things from that too. We can take what we're learning from anywhere. So unless there's anything else you want to finish up on, Jordan.
No, just thanks very much for having me on.
Yeah, no, excellent. No, thanks so much. And thank you for the listeners. Hopefully it's been as useful to you as it has been for me. So cheers again, Jordan. And for those listening, we will see you next time.